In today's episode, we're going to dive into a little over or underrated on fermented foods, which are a popular suggestion when it comes to improving gut health and the state of your microbiome. Now, there's many things we can do when it comes to improving our gut health and our metabolic health as a whole. But with gut health specifically, you hear a lot of things thrown around, right? Fermented foods, kombucha, probiotics, fiber consumption, and maybe even other supplements that are touted to lead to improved state of microbiome health or reducing IBS symptoms, and so much more. So inside today's episode, we're going to zoom in and focus on fermented foods specifically, and if some of these claims are appropriate or overstated and leading to more confusion when it comes to improving the state of health of our gut. So gut health, obviously very important topic, but incredibly trendy. And because of the trends, a lot of people tend to fall victim to some of the hype and hysteria when it comes to things like fermented foods or fermented beverages. And while these things can be beneficial, we need to understand when to consume them, why we're consuming them, and if certain fermented foods may be better than others. We can also compare some of the benefits conferred from fermented foods to fiber-rich foods or other foods that tend to enhance the state of our gut microbiota. Many of the common recommendations you hear when it comes to improving your gut health as a whole tend to be very focused on removing processed food consumption, adding in fibrous foods, and in some cases, eating maybe fermented foods or dairy or things that are containing probiotics or, potentially containing those beneficial organisms. But what does the data actually say? Is a daily kombucha going to help combat IBS, or is it just a really expensive flavored beverage? So things we'll examine today. First, we'll look at defining what fermented foods are. We'll talk about the data around fermented foods, some of the potential benefits and the underlying contributors to poor gut health, such as intestinal permeability and bacterial dysbiosis. We'll also look at a direct comparison between fermented foods and fiber and see which one comes out on top in terms of adding a variety of fibrous foods to the diet versus consuming fermented foods. And then we'll talk about sources and misconceptions, because some things are marketed as fermented, or we think that they're fermented. We assume that when we're shopping at the grocery store that we're buying a fermented food, when in reality we may not be getting all of those benefits because those foods have been pasteurized. So first and foremost, why do fermented foods have health benefits in the first place? Fermented foods are plant or animal foods that have sat around long enough in correct conditions to allow for beneficial or commensal bacteria to grow. The types of bacteria can be very wide ranging in nature, so it's not going to be one particular strain. For example, fermented milk like kefir can potentially have lactobacillus species with some others. So when we're looking at this, Greek yogurt, other dairy sources can have sort of this range of species. Fermented vegetables like kimchi contain a massively wide array that would be too long to list. Again, so some of these dairy options are going to be mostly lactobacillus, whereas fermented vegetables might have a much broader spectrum. In other words, they're a great way to get in probiotics on a daily basis besides taking your probiotic supplement if you choose. The doses you'd get in foods are going to be much lower than what you see in supplementation. Adequately dosed supplementation of probiotics, typically we're talking about billions of colony forming units, and that's billions with a B, not millions. And so there might be a greater density and maybe even a broader spectrum in your probiotic supplement, just depending on the quality of the supplement that you choose. The doses you'd get in foods, again, are a little bit lower, but first, of course, when we're consuming foods, we're also getting the macronutrients and micronutrients from those foods too. So for example, if this is dairy and we're having a fermented dairy product, we're also getting calcium. If we're consuming a fermented vegetable, we're likely consuming a bit of fiber with that. Maybe we're getting some antioxidants. There will be other benefits from the food, especially if it's a single ingredient whole food. Bacterial fermentation generally forms other beneficial metabolites as well, aside from just talking about some of the commensal bacteria. Things like short-chain fatty acids can be another benefit to the gut and can help with satiety and insulin sensitivity, but there's other things as well. So fermentation can also lead to addition of vitamins and minerals and neuroactive molecules that can aid our overall health. So when we look at fermented food consumption, there's a couple things that it can actually do in terms of benefiting the state of the gut, and even when we take into account more of the granular aspects, right, of leaky gut, gut dysbiosis, IBS. So one particular study looking at fermented foods and dysbiosis looked at 115 participants, and they consumed fermented foods over a 4-week time period. They noticed significantly increased diversity in their gut microbiome with lower pathogenic species. So these are your opportunistic bacteria, some of the overgrowths that people are typically trying to trim, and significantly improved the overall profile of the gut microbiota. This also came with lower symptoms of IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome. Remember, IBS is more of an umbrella classification versus being, one specific condition. Another study that was particularly interesting compared fermented foods to fibrous foods, or including, a variety of fiber consumption over a period of 17 weeks. At the end of the study, the group eating the fermented foods significantly improved the diversity of their gut. The group eating diverse fiber sources did not. Now, is it possible that it might have just taken a longer time horizon with the fiber-rich sources? Potentially, but what's also true is the fermented foods are going to contain those organisms, whereas the fibrous foods are maybe conferring their benefits via a different way. Other mouse and human studies have shown improvements to the microbiome with fiber consumption, so it may be that this study wasn't just quite where we needed in terms of the duration to actually yield the benefits or to have a substantial comparison here. But what about intestinal permeability, or what's popularly known on social media as leaky gut? Now, just for your information, dysbiosis plays an enormous role in intestinal permeability. So for improving dysbiosis, as we talked about in the previous study with just over 100 participants, then it's likely that we're improving the intestinal permeability or leaky gut as well. Human studies are lacking on this topic, but we have numerous rodent studies showing significant improvement in gut barrier integrity, or basically looking at that permeability. And slightly off topic, but interesting, this almost always translates to improved blood-brain barrier integrity whenever it was measured. This has major implications in terms of lowering neuroinflammation, potential implications in terms of depression, anxiety, appetite regulation, and so much more. So anytime we're talking about intestinal permeability, or we're talking about the blood-brain barrier, those are going to be important considerations when we begin to look at nutrition's connection to mental health as well. Another thing we can look at is basically inflammation and the inflammatory response. So would there be any benefits in terms of fermented foods and things that we're seeing in our serum lab markers or biochemistry? A recent 2023 meta-analysis on the topic showed basically when we consume more of those fermented foods, we had significantly lowered highly sensitive C-reactive protein in humans, which is a primary measure of inflammation. So an acute phase reactant in our serum labs that's frequently used to assess inflammation. And the HS-CRP is a slightly more sensitive marker than just our CRP quant. And if we're lowering inflammation, since most disease states have that inflammatory component, a logical question you might ask is if fermented foods could potentially help with things like insulin resistance or other conditions that people struggle with when it comes to their metabolic health. The answer seems to be yes. We do see improvements in glucose regulation, and even as people may be in the development of things like type 2 diabetes, we see reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, reduced depression, anxiety, and one study even showed reduced soreness after exercise with fermented food consumption. Now, there is a caveat here with fermented foods, and that is for individuals who have gut issues and have a histamine intolerance. Fermented foods may be a no-go for a period of time until we address kind of the root cause of those gut issues and deal with some of the histamine intolerance and get those symptoms managed. Fermented foods, this is the biggest caveat I would say, aside from just sometimes from a palatability perspective, some people don't particularly enjoy fermented foods out of the gate. If you notice that you have worse gut symptoms, brain fog, any sort of joint pain or joint symptoms, potentially allergy-like symptoms, whether those be more of a response in terms of maybe nasal drip or sniffling or any skin symptoms, it may be best to temporarily exclude those fermented foods for the time being. In this case, you might be in a state of what's known as histamine intolerance. One of the metabolites that's generated during fermentation is histamine. So normally your gut makes enough of an enzyme called DAO to break down this histamine before it reaches your blood in circulation. But if you're lacking that DAO, more histamine is basically reaching the bloodstream from potentially those fermented foods, which can cause many of those symptoms that I just mentioned. Histamine intolerance can happen from many of the same risk factors as IBS. So chronic stress, poor diet, micronutrient deficiencies, all of those things can contribute to histamine intolerance. If you are over-exercising, experience sleep loss, insomnia, or even being too sedentary, a lot of those same drivers of metabolic disarray and dysfunction can play into people suffering from histamine intolerance. When it comes to choosing fermented foods, This is really something that requires a little bit of attention to detail because many fermented foods at the grocery store have been pasteurized, which causes them to lose a lot of the benefits that they would normally confer. So when we classically think of fermented foods like sauerkraut, for example, if they're pasteurized, they may actually be devoid of bacteria. And most grocery store sauerkraut brands are going to fit this description. So you're going to want to look for maybe sauerkraut or kimchi that would still have the probiotics in it and specifically state that it's not pasteurized. Other options are going to include fermented dairy, so potentially something like Greek yogurt could fit here as well. And if you do go with kombucha, kimchi, or real sauerkraut, remember for the more vegetable-based options or things that are cabbage, we are going to make sure that those are not pasteurized. Sauerkraut and kimchi are spontaneously fermented, which generates a significantly wider array of bacteria and metabolites than fermented dairy. But if you've been sensitive to fermented foods in the past, it might actually make sense to start with the fermented dairy because it's going to be a more narrow range of bacteria most likely compared to that spontaneous fermentation. And you may actually get significantly less histamine compared to some of the other sources of fermented foods. Frequency-wise, the literature shows that you get benefit from at least one serving of fermented foods per day. For example, in one of the studies I referenced earlier, it was about 10 ounces of a fermented dairy product, and that was enough to basically confer many of those benefits that we saw in terms of gut health and metabolic health as well. As we're wrapping up here, the bottom line is that daily fermented food consumption is one of the more powerful things we can do to keep the gut healthy, just making sure that we're buying the fermented foods that still have a lot of those benefits versus ones that have been pasteurized and have lost some of those beneficial bacteria. We see other health benefits aside from just direct gut microbiota changes, and that includes lower inflammation, better glucose control and insulin sensitivity, lower risk of cardiovascular disease, and others. And this has been substantiated in human evidence and research to where we have pretty reliable data here to show that, hey, consuming these foods from time to time could be a good thing for your metabolic health so long as you don't have those histamine issues that I mentioned. Remember, there is a chance that you can react negatively to fermented foods, in which case I'd potentially be investigating histamine intolerance and improving the state of your gut as a whole, addressing gut dysbiosis as well as intestinal permeability. If you're interested and you're a health professional in learning more about gut dysbiosis, intestinal permeability, nutrition for improving gut health, and ways to address some of these issues naturally through lifestyle training and nutrition, head over to metabolismschool.com to learn more about my nutrition and metabolism specialization program. If you learned something new, enjoyed this episode, or found the studies interesting and you think someone else would benefit, please share the show. You can do that by either copying the link of wherever you're listening to this particular episode or by dropping a 5-star rating and review on audio platforms. Give it a thumbs up on YouTube and make sure you're subscribed on audio and video so you never miss an episode. This content is designed to enhance and continue the ripple effect of coaching as my team and I shared no-cost content with the world. Chances are you probably never would have found this platform or podcast in the first place if one of my original listeners never shared it with you. This could have been by leaving a rating and review, messaging it to you the old-fashioned way, or maybe screenshotting the show and posting it on their Instagram stories or social media wherever they share stuff. So do me a favor and pay it forward and share this content with the world. It's